December 1944. A frozen field somewhere in the Ardennes. An American infantryman pulls a metal canteen from inside his field jacket. The water inside is murky, tasting faintly of chlorine, a taste he's come to hate. He drinks it anyway. Within 2 hours, he's fine. He'll move out of that foxhole, he'll fight, and he will not die of what was in that canteen. Now move roughly 1,000 miles east and 2 years back in time. Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army sits encircled, the temperature down near 25 below zero. A German soldier writes home about hunger and cold and about something that never made it into the propaganda newsreels back home: dysentery. The documented medical record of that siege, drawn from German field records and survivor accounts, describes the same picture in source after source. Soldiers dying of dysentery, typhus, diphtheria, tuberculosis, jaundice, and, according to post-war historians who worked through the captured German medical files, latrines so contaminated that men too weak to climb back out simply died where they'd fallen. Those two men were eating roughly comparable rations. They were facing broadly comparable enemies. In many cases, they were drinking from rivers and wells that would have looked identical to the naked eye. One of them survived. The other, statistically, very often did not. The actual difference between them, more than any tank, more than any rifle, more than any aircraft, came down to a question no army on Earth had fully solved before 1944. How do you reliably get clean drinking water to a man sitting in a hole in the ground, mile after mile, for years at a stretch? It's worth sitting with how strange that question actually is, coming from the wealthiest, most industrialized military machine ever assembled, a country that had just landed 850,000 men on a single stretch of beach inside a single month. One of the things that quietly made that machine work wasn't the bomber or the bazooka. It was something a captured German officer, interrogated near Liège that winter, admitted he genuinely couldn't understand about the men on the other side of the line. Why is it, he wanted to know, that your soldiers in the foxholes always have water? To understand why that question stumped him, and why the answer is arguably one of the more overlooked pieces of architecture behind the American victory in two oceans at once, you have to go back. Not to 1944, not even to 1941, but to 1898, and a sweltering training camp in Florida where the U.S. Army first learned, at brutal cost, the lesson that would eventually save more American lives than any single weapon developed in the entire 20th century. Here's a fact that should genuinely reorganize how you think about American military history. For roughly the first 145 years of it, the deadliest enemy the American soldier ever faced wasn't the British Army, the Confederacy, the Spanish, the Germans, or the Japanese. It was a microorganism small enough that several million of them could fit in a single glass of water. The numbers, documented in the U.S. Army's own official medical histories, are genuinely hard to absorb on first reading. Of the roughly 620,000 military deaths in the American Civil War, something close to 2/3 came from disease rather than combat, and the single largest killer in that entire war wasn't the bullet or the cannonball, it was dysentery and diarrhea. Bacterial infections passed soldier to soldier through fecal contamination of food and water. The Union Army alone recorded more than 1.5 million cases of intestinal disease, with something on the order of 57,000 deaths traced directly to those infections, on top of a separate wave of deaths from waterborne typhoid. And untold thousands more who were finally killed by wounds a genuinely healthy man might well have survived. The mechanism wasn't mysterious even at the time. Soldiers dug latrines upstream of the same wells they drank from, filled canteens from creeks a dead horse had been rotting in a quarter-mile upstream, and generally assumed thirst would kill them faster than whatever was actually in the water. They were very often wrong. A Civil War surgeon named Joseph Janvier Woodward had already published a detailed field study connecting contaminated water directly to thousands of these deaths. The link was understood in broad terms by 1862. What didn't yet exist was any way to actually do something about it at scale. Jump forward 33 years to 1898, and the Spanish-American War, and the same failure repeats almost exactly. Volunteers poured into hastily thrown together training camps across Florida, Georgia, Virginia, and Pennsylvania this summer, with latrines sited too close to kitchens and kitchens sited too close to water sources, and within weeks an invisible epidemic was moving through every camp. The numbers from that specific war remain some of the starkest in American military medical history. Of roughly 171,000 personnel mobilized, more than 20,000 were hospitalized with typhoid fever, and by the end of 1898, the Army had recorded 2,192 deaths from typhoid alone, against a combat death toll for the entire war of 379, or, on the more generous count that includes deaths from wounds, roughly 968. By any honest reckoning, for every American killed by a Spanish bullet, somewhere between 5 and 7 were killed by American drinking water. Army Surgeon General George Sternberg ordered a formal investigation, led by a young physician most people today know for entirely different work, Major Walter Reed, whose subsequent research on yellow fever would make him famous. Reed and his colleagues toured the camps, mapped the outbreaks, and confirmed what the British physician William Budd had already argued back in 1839, that typhoid traveled specifically through human waste contaminating drinking water. The Reed Board's official report on the 1898 typhoid outbreaks, eventually published in 1904, is still cited in military medical literature today, and it fundamentally changed how the Army thought about water going forward. Here's the part of the story that rarely makes it into any standard account. The junior officers who survived those Florida camps, who watched their own men die screaming from a disease the enemy had never even fired a shot to inflict, went on to become the colonels and generals of the First World War. And afterward, the quiet policy writers of the interwar army, the men sitting in Washington offices through the 1920s and 1930s, asking persistently and mostly without much public attention why a soldier still had to gamble every single time he filled his canteen. By the end of the First World War, the ratio had genuinely started to shift. In the American expeditionary forces in Europe, disease deaths had finally dropped below battle deaths for the first time in American military history, while the British lost only 260 men to typhoid across the entire war on the Western Front. Vaccines helped, sanitation discipline helped, and one piece of equipment, almost comically low-tech given what it was about to accomplish, started showing up in every American camp from Texas to the trenches of France. A canvas bag hung from a tripod, with 6 small spigots at the bottom and a tight-fitting lid on top. I think the man behind that bag deserves a longer introduction than he usually gets, because his name almost never makes it into popular retellings of this war, even though the device carries it. Major William J. L. Lister, an Army Medical Corps surgeon born in 1869, had spent years in the kind of forgettable peacetime garrison postings most Army physicians quietly built careers in and quietly retired from without much notice. Lister didn't retire quietly. Around 1910, he grew interested in what would today be called public health epidemiology, working in parallel with another Army physician, Major Carl Rogers Darnell, who that same year gave the first practical demonstration of purifying water with liquid chlorine, a discovery Lister built directly on. The underlying chemistry, calcium hypochlorite, ordinary bleaching powder, wasn't new. Municipal water systems in Britain and the United States had already been using it since the late 19th century. The problem had never been the chemistry, it was scale. A municipal treatment plant is a permanent building full of concrete tanks and trained engineers, and you cannot fold one into a saddlebag or set it up in a bivouac that's breaking camp again tomorrow morning. What Lister actually contributed, perfected by 1913 and formally issued to the Army in 1917, was almost insultingly simple by comparison. A heavy canvas bag lined with rubber to slow leakage, 6 spigots fitted around the bottom, a snug cloth lid to keep out dust and insects holding 36 gallons and weighing next to nothing when empty. You strung it from a tripod of tent poles or cut branches, well clear of any tree birds might be roosting in, filled it with the cleanest local water available, strained through cloth if you had to, added a precisely measured dose of calcium hypochlorite from a sealed ampule, waited 30 minutes, and tested the residual chlorine with a small reagent kit before opening the taps. Now, that was the entire device. That was the entire procedure. Known as the Lister bag, sometimes misspelled Lister bag, after the more famous surgeon Joseph Lister, though the two men are unrelated, it became standard equipment in every American field, kitchen, and encampment from Pershing's Mexican expedition onward, and it proved so reliable, so cheap, and so easy to maintain that it stayed in frontline service through the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam, not formally retired until reverse osmosis units replaced it decades later. 60 years of continuous field service from a piece of equipment that cost less than a single pair of army boots. The bag alone couldn't solve the war that was coming, though. 36 gallons on a tripod is genuinely useful at a battalion kitchen. It's completely useless to a rifleman 500 yards into a forest with nothing but a single canteen on his hip. So while Lister's bag was becoming standard issue, 2 other researchers were working on the next piece of the same puzzle. Henry Drysdale Dakin, a British organic chemist already well known for the wound antiseptic solution that still carries his name, and Edward Kellogg Dunham, an American pathologist. Working first separately and then together during the First World War, they developed a stable, chlorine-releasing compound small enough to press into a tablet a soldier could simply drop into his own canteen. Halazone, chemically dichlorosulfamobenzoic acid, 2 tablets per canteen, roughly 30 minutes of contact time, and the most common bacterial threats in the water were dead. The tablets weren't perfect. A strong chlorine aftertaste, a limited shelf life once the bottle was opened, slower action against some organisms. But for genuine field emergencies, they worked reliably enough to matter. Through the 1920s and 1930s, while the Army's overall budget was being cut to almost nothing during the Depression, a fairly unglamorous handful of officers in the Quartermaster Corps and the medical department kept quietly refining the whole system anyway, writing field manuals, training dedicated sanitation specialists, working out precisely how many chlorine ampules a battalion needed per day, and persuading a procurement office that no congressman was especially eager to fund to keep ordering Lister bags and halazone bottles year after year regardless. Britain's Royal Army Medical Corps had its own purification doctrine built around the Horrocks box, named for Sir William Heaton Horrocks, using sand filtration paired with chlorine sterilization. The German Wehrmacht issued its own bleach ampules and chlorine-neutralizing tubes for company and battery-level water disinfection, along with a portable rucksack-mounted filter unit called the tornister filter Jarrett, detailed enough that American intelligence had already captured, translated, and published tactical bulletins on the German system as early as November 1943. That decision was about to face the 2 worst environments the U.S. Army had ever fought in at once: a desert with essentially no water at all, and a jungle with far too much of the wrong kind. The American soldier in either theater had access to clean water through what amounted to a 3-tier system, though almost nobody who actually used it at the time would have described it in those terms. The first tier was purely individual. Every soldier carried a canteen, and halazone tablets rode close at hand in his ration pack. The K-ration breakfast unit, the single most commonly issued field ration of the entire war, included halazone tablets alongside the instant coffee and chopped ham and eggs. C-ration accessory packs carried them straight through 1945, and both the jungle first aid kit and the aeronautical first aid kit each included a sealed bottle of 100 tablets manufactured by Abbott Laboratories. Pacific veterans later described their routine in near-identical terms across dozens of separate accounts. Dip the canteen in a stream, drop in 2 tablets, cap it, shake it, hang it back on the belt, wait roughly 20 minutes, then drink. The water tasted unmistakably of chlorine, and soldiers hated the taste almost universally. Post-war reviews by the Army's own Medical Technical Committee confirmed the tablets stayed effective even from bottles a year or 2 old, and that soldiers who actually followed the protocol generally did not die of what they drank. The second tier operated at the unit level. Every company, battery, and field kitchen kept at least 1 Lister bag on hand. Larger units, several, hung near the mess area or a designated water point, and maintained by a trained sanitation NCO present in every company-sized unit, filling the bag from the cleanest source available, adding the calcium hypochlorite, timing the weight, testing the residual chlorine, then opening the spigots for men filling their own canteens or dipping mess kit cups. A small, unglamorous piece of cloth and rubber, repeated something like 10,000 times a day across every active theater of the war. The third tier is where the American approach diverged completely from every other army in the conflict, because it wasn't personal equipment or unit-level discipline at all. It was dedicated infrastructure. The U.S. Army fielded entire formations. Not engineers who handled water as a side task, not medics who tested it occasionally, but full water supply units whose sole institutional purpose was producing, purifying, storing, and distributing potable water at scale. The 405th Engineer Water Supply Battalion operated with 5th Army through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy from 1943 into 1945. In the Pacific, the 1,517th and 1,519th Engineer Water Supply Companies worked in and around Manila. The 1,518th served on Biak, and dozens of comparable units appear, scattered across surviving Army rosters from nearly every theater of the war, including black engineer battalions, such as the 96th Engineer General Service Regiment, which built water points across the Pacific, Burma, North Africa, and Europe, work that post-war records, by most honest accounts, too often credited elsewhere or left largely unrecorded at all. These units drilled wells, captured natural springs, built improvised reservoirs out of canvas and rubber, and operated portable purification rigs directly behind advancing combat divisions. Toward the war's later stages, SEC, the Army Engineer Research and Development Laboratory at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, fielded a van-mounted, electrically driven purification unit, officially designated the Water Purification Unit, van type, body-mounted. Soldiers, inevitably, just called it the ERD later, after the lab's own acronym, pronounced roughly ERDA later. A single unit could produce somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 gallons of potable water a day, enough on its own to adequately supply an infantry battalion under genuinely harsh field conditions, and by the war's later stages, these mobile units were routinely moving forward with the combat divisions themselves, setting up new water points within hours of a position being secured. Stop and actually consider what that means in practice. When an American infantry battalion took a piece of ground in Belgium or on Luzon, an engineer water supply detachment was frequently right behind them with the equipment to start producing safe drinking water at the new position. Sometimes that same day, water manufactured forward at the point of need from whatever local source the engineers could exploit rather than trucked up from a rear depot miles behind the line. Set that directly against the German Army's standard approach, documented in Wehrmacht hygiene regulations and confirmed in the surviving records of the Afrika Korps. Drinking water issued only after inspection by a military medical officer, run through portable filters like the Tornister filter Jarrett or the older AF2 and F4 models the German Army had been using since the First World War, with chemical treatment handled at the company and battery level, using bleach paired with a hydrogen peroxide and carbamide chlorine neutralizer. The chemistry worked. The doctrine existed, and so did the training. What simply didn't exist on the German side was a dedicated industrial water supply branch. No German equivalent of the 405th Engineer Water Supply Battalion, no German ERD later. In the deep desert of North Africa, drinking water for Rommel's own Panzer Army had to be hauled forward in petrol cans from coastal ports, sometimes hundreds of kilometers down a single exposed coastal road, rationed at roughly 4.5 liters per man per day, of which, according to campaign historians who've reviewed the surviving logistics records, close to half went to cooking and topping up vehicle radiators rather than drinking. A German soldier in the line might have had 2 liters of actual drinking water a day, in a desert where his American or British counterpart routinely had several times that available to him. That gap is essentially the answer the German officer captured near Liège couldn't quite put into words. He thought he was looking at a piece of technology. He was actually looking at a logistical philosophy. The decision, made at the doctrinal level, that the American soldier in a foxhole would never be expected to solve his own water problem. The system would solve it for him, and he'd simply drink what the system handed him. How well that system actually scaled under the worst environmental conditions any modern army had yet fought in is where the real test came. From the coral atolls of the Pacific to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Pacific Theater specifically ranks, by nearly every measurable index, among the harshest environments the U.S. Army ever operated in. Not necessarily because the Japanese soldier fought better than the German soldier, a comparison historians still argue over, but because the climate, terrain, and microbial load of the region added a genuine third enemy to every single engagement. Heat, humidity, standing water, mosquitoes, and microscopic parasites in nearly every stream, producing dysentery, malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, leishmaniasis, hookworm, and jungle rot that could take a man out of the line without a single shot being fired at him. The published U.S. military medical histories put real numbers on this. Across the entire war, the Army recorded roughly 17 million hospital admissions worldwide for illness or accident, against roughly 1 million admissions for actual combat casualties, a ratio near 17-1, and considerably worse than that in the earliest Pacific operations specifically, where some estimates put non-combat casualties from heat and disease at roughly 100 for every single casualty the enemy inflicted directly. In the South Pacific Theater alone between 1942 and 1945, recorded cases include roughly 757,000 instances of dysentery or diarrheal illness, close to 573,000 cases of malaria, and over 120,000 cases of dengue. Nearly every man who served on Guadalcanal contracted malaria at some point, with an average of more than 5,000 soldiers on the sick list from malaria alone on any given day. General Douglas MacArthur reportedly complained, in remarks later recorded by the Army's own malaria control branch, that for every division he had facing the enemy directly, he effectively needed to account for a second division in hospital beds and a third still convalescing behind the line. And yet, this is the specific fact that genuinely haunts the medical histories of this campaign. The U.S. Army survived the Pacific in a form recognizably intact. The disease numbers above are grim on their own terms, but they represent something considerably less catastrophic than what almost certainly would have happened without the Lister bags, without halazone, without water supply companies setting up purification points on newly captured beaches within 24 hours of a landing, and without the underlying doctrinal assumption, built into the system decades earlier, that no soldier in the line was ever supposed to have to drink unpurified water if any chain of supply could conceivably reach him in time. Japanese forces in the same islands had no real equivalent system to fall back on. By the war's later stages, with their own supply lines increasingly cut by American submarines, Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands, were assessed by Allied medical observers as running close to 90% combat ineffective from the combined weight of malaria, dysentery, and outright starvation. Move now from the equator to the snowline. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Temperatures in the Ardennes forest dropping to 30 and 40 degrees below zero at night. Tanks freezing solid where they stood. Wounded men freezing to death before litter teams could physically reach them. And in the foxholes, American troops ran into a problem nobody training in Florida or Pennsylvania had fully worked out in advance. A canteen freezes solid within a few hours in that kind of cold. William Schukert, an American infantryman whose first-hand account survives in the Army's own official records of the battle, described his own platoon's daily routine. 6 men crammed into a foxhole roofed over with cut tree branches, reluctant to leave it at all, given the nearly constant German shelling, taking turns crawling out one at a time to drag the whole group's canteens to a nearby stream and back. On one such trip, by his own account, Schukert reached the usual water point and found 3 dead German soldiers lying in it. He moved further downstream to a spot where the water at least looked cleaner, filled the canteens, and started back. And German shelling opened up while he was still exposed, shrapnel striking his own rifle and blowing the top clean off one canteen. He survived that particular trip. Plenty of men making similar trips across that same winter did not. Halazone tablets worked noticeably more slowly in genuinely cold water, sometimes needing double the usual contact time. And Lister bags themselves can simply freeze solid. Forward water points in the Ardennes were sometimes 2 or 3 miles behind the actual line. But the chain held through what remains the worst winter of the entire European campaign, with men eating frozen K rations and trying to thaw canteens against their own bodies. And the supply of purified water, not always enough of it, not always fast enough to keep reaching the front line, turned back to the other side of that same line 2 winters earlier. At Stalingrad, the German 6th Army sat trapped in a Russian winter every bit as brutal as the one in the Ardennes, and the published medical histories of that specific encirclement describe something with genuinely few parallels anywhere else in 20th century warfare. Soldiers dying of typhus, dysentery, frostbite, and starvation simultaneously, latrines where men too weak with dysentery to climb back out were simply left where they'd collapsed, lice carrying typhus from one exhausted man to the next. The British historian Anthony Beevor, drawing on captured German medical records and surviving veteran accounts, documented fear of typhus running so deep through the German command structure that Polish resistance fighters in occupied territory reportedly learned to deliberately exploit that specific German phobia to help cover underground operations. The German army at Stalingrad had been fully cut off from its own supply network in a way the American army in the Ardennes never was, so the two situations aren't precisely equivalent, but the gap between them still says something real about how each system performed once genuinely pushed to its limit. One kept producing, the other simply stopped. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call this one of the more genuinely undertold turning points in American military history, precisely because it never produced a single dramatic battlefield moment anyone could put on a recruiting poster. Medical historians mark 1941 as the exact boundary between what they call the disease era, running back to 1775, and the trauma era that followed. The point where American combat deaths finally, permanently overtook deaths from infectious disease. The bacteria themselves hadn't changed. They're exactly as dangerous today as they were in 1898 to anyone drinking contaminated water unprotected. What changed was the architecture built around the individual soldier. Sulfa drugs and penicillin genuinely mattered, and so did vaccines against tetanus and typhoid. And so did DDT deployed against louse-borne typhus to remarkable effect in Naples in 1943 and again in the liberated concentration camps in 1945. But underneath all of that, before any pill or injection, sat the water itself. German prisoners taken in the war's closing months were extensively debriefed by American military intelligence. Camp Tracy, alone in California, reportedly processed several thousand German and Japanese prisoners through hidden microphone interrogation rooms over the course of the war. And the surviving records carry a consistent thread of something close to weary astonishment at the food, the clothing, the medical care, and repeatedly the water. Many of these men had spent 2 years or more on the Eastern Front watching their own army die of disease in staggering numbers, had heard scattered rumors about American logistics, and had assumed the rumors were simply propaganda. Then they were captured, processed, and handed a canteen of ordinary clean water, and realized what none of them could replicate had never been a single object anyway. Not a bag, not a tablet, not a van, all of which sat in German field manuals and translation already. It was the decision, made decades before the shooting ever started, that an American soldier's drinking water counted as a legitimate national strategic asset. The willingness to keep funding dedicated water supply battalions through a Depression-era budget nobody in Congress was eager to expand. The choice to train something on the order of 40,000 specialists in field sanitation and embed them down at the company level, and an assumption, rarely stated outright even in the Army's own official histories, that the United States would simply never again lose a battle to men drinking from the wrong stream. Bring it back to the two soldiers this story opened with. The American infantryman in the Ardennes with his half-frozen, chlorine-tainted canteen. The German soldier at Stalingrad 2 winters earlier, dying of dysentery in a city where the river itself had been undrinkable for months, and the temperature never rose above freezing. A bullet would have killed either one of them in an instant. The cold alone could have killed both of them in a single night. The water is where the long, mostly invisible arithmetic of the entire war actually settled, built over roughly 3 decades by men whose names almost nobody remembers today, paying the ordinary soldier in the foxhole a tiny daily dividend that, multiplied across roughly 8 million men in uniform, quietly helped decide who came home and who didn't. The privates of the 1,517th Engineer Water Supply Company never received statues. William Lister himself died in Washington, D.C. in 1947 and is buried today at Arlington National Cemetery in a grave very few visitors ever stop at. The bag that still carries his name barely rates a footnote in most popular retellings of this war. The men who designed, built, and operated this entire system generally didn't win medals for it. Those went, as they usually do, to the men who broke enemy lines, took the towns, and crossed the rivers, while the men who quietly kept the water flowing stayed almost entirely out of frame. That's the actual bill that came due in 1944 and 1945. Not a weapon, but a piece of canvas hanging from a tripod, a tablet roughly the size of an aspirin, a van with a pump in the back, and behind all three, a stubborn, decades-long institutional memory running from a typhoid camp in Florida in 1898, through a quiet Army surgeon's sanitary research around 1910, through the water supply battalions that walked into North Africa in 1942, all the way to a foxhole in the Ardennes during the worst winter of the entire war. If you had a relative who served in an engineer water supply company, a quartermaster sanitation detachment, or anywhere in that long, mostly invisible chain that kept American soldiers drinking safely across 2 oceans of fighting, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Unit number, theater, whatever they told you about that specific work. Because these are exactly the details that almost never make it into any textbook, and that historians a century from now are going to need someone to have written down somewhere.